The Southern Sinagua cultural tradition covers a vast landscape in central Arizona known as the Verde Valley. Although we do not know what the Sinagua people called themselves, the modern label translates to without water. This Spanish name is quite inaccurate when referring to the early ancestors of modern Hopi people. In reality, Sinagua people had vast amounts of water from the Verde River that cut across the landscape and offered rich resources for building and crafting materials. Thanks to the hard work of archaeologists such as Peter Pillis, we have gained tremendous insight on how Sinagua people conducted their complex lives. The earliest group of Sinagua people appear in the archaeological record around AD 600, where settlements including pit homes were constructed and trading with groups to the south, north, and west occurred. Trade items included already crafted shell ornaments, minerals, decorated ceramics, copper bells, macaws, feathers, food items, and much more. Sometime around AD 1100, we see a gradual shift away from pit house architecture and towards pueblo structures. Some hilltop pueblos such as Sugarloaf and Tuzigoot were constructed during the Hananki phase around AD 1150 and begin as smaller pueblo units. During this phase, archaeology finds its greatest density of cliff dwellings. When the Hananki phase ends around 1300, pueblos are much larger, and some outlying populations that are smaller in size begin to migrate into sites such as Bridgeport, Sugarloaf, and Tuzigoot to form larger city-states. Although Sinagua people did not decorate their ceramics, production and distribution of plainwares throughout time and space is evident throughout the archaeological record. During the later Tuzigoot phase, we see a high and somewhat equal distribution of locally produced plain and redware vessels in and around large city-states. While decorated black-on-white pots are still imported, a new density of Jedito wares appear around 1300 to 1450, sometimes even depicting horned serpent and macaw motifs. Years ago, I began my journey in researching prehistoric native cultures throughout the American Southwest during agricultural times. Specifically, my research led me to the question of how different societies and organizations utilize their decorated and non-decorated ceramics, part of a larger regional economic system, in equal and non-equal distribution. It's quite fascinating. My research ultimately led me to the Southern Sinagua world and how they utilize their ceramics locally and non-locally as well. In this video, I want to take you step by step in reproducing and recreating a Southern Sinagua Tuzigoot face style jar. Okay, so this pot has been sitting in the bag, curing out a bit for the past few days, and now it's time to apply the red hematite on the surface of this pot. So here I have a large block of beautiful red hematite, a coarse ground stone that I'll be creating the pigment on, a cup of water, and then my polishing stone. So I will show you that process right now. Of course, a paintbrush to paint the hematite on the surface. So the first thing that I do is I just take the red hematite and I create a slurry. So I'll start on the bottom of this pot, and you can see how beautiful red this hematite is. This will take multiple applications, and in between applications I use a polishing stone to work the hematite into the clay. Here I have a base coat of the red hematite, and I just take a polishing stone and I burnish the material into the clay body. So all the way around, top, bottom, rim, everywhere that I applied this red hematite. Then we let it sit for about an hour and apply a second coat. Repeat the same process. You want to allow the hematite to dry with the clay. Here is my second coat. You can see it's polished and filling in really nice. I will now let this dry a little bit longer and apply the third coat. It's been a few days since I applied the layers of hematite on this jar, and you can see what it's looking like now. I have a very high polish and the jar is just about dry. So what I'm doing to create this high polish and to finish this jar before firing it is I'm taking a very smooth polishing stone and just lightly burnishing the surface of this pot. And you can see as a result you get a very, very high polish, and it really impregnates the clay particles with this hematite. So this hematite will end up sticking during the firing process. Here is my jar completely dry. You can see the hematite is worked into the clay body, so when I run my thumb across the surface, there's no hematite that rubs off. That's a good sign. It's now time to fire this jar. So the later Tuzigoot phase pottery, the jars and the bowls, typically speaking, did not have cover sherds present. Therefore, fire clouds were also present on the jar surface. This is completely opposite in comparison to the later phase classic period Hohokam salt and Gila riverwares, where you did have cover sherds present and there was very little fire clouds. So following in the Sinagua footsteps, we will fire this now in oxidation. Okay, so I'm going to fire right on the surface, and that's going to help improve the colors within all of these vessels. So I have 3 jars, including the Tuzigoot redware, and then we also have a scarlet macaw effigy or a macaw effigy and an incense burner. So the macaw and the incense burner are Kiowa's, and then the 3 jars are mine. I'm just creating a nice hot bed of coals, and then the real work begins. Okay, so we got a good set of coals, and I'm going to start placing the kiln furniture and the pots inside, and we will just let these heat up even more. So I'm just using broken pot sherds from previous pots that I fired. So these are already superheated, much like volcanic stone. And I'll place the pots, of course, on top of the kiln furniture. Whew. That's hot.
Damn. Yeah, I know those polished ones get really, really hot.
Yep. They sure do. I'm gonna put yours right in the center because that's
Okay.
That's the one that's gonna require the most heat. Woo, that's warm. And bowl right there. In Cincinnati. Wow.
It's probably hot enough to start stacking.
I think so too. Okay, so it is now time for the primary fire. So we're just going to stack these logs of juniper around these pots and let this thing rip. Last thing, sage for good luck. One way to see how these pots fired while still on the coals is just to take a stick and see how they ring. That jar has a nice ring to it. The Tuzigoot jar, same thing. You can hear that high ring. Another beautiful ring. This one's on heavier kiln furniture, so we won't get that high pitch. And then the bowl. We'll have to see. It doesn't have the ring it usually does. So there might be a crack in that. Only time will tell. You can see now, since this Tuzigoot redware jar is really starting to cool down, that beautiful red color starts to appear. This is almost identical in color to what you see in the archaeological record. I just pulled the vessels off of the coals and everything fired nice and hard. The macaw, the two jars. The bowl doesn't have the highest ring, but no cracks. And then finally, the redware jar fired nice and hard. Well, it's the next morning and you can see this jar is now cleaned up. I have a little bit of wood ash on the surface, but nonetheless, I got a beautiful red color, some fire clouding, very light fire clouding on the surface. And this fired very hard. You can hear that ring. I plan to use this in the future and I'm very pleased with the results.